Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, episode number 113 with Pastor Léonce Crump, former NFL player, former University of Oklahoma football player, as well as three-time All-American heavyweight wrestler. And this podcast is sponsored by Compassion International. We are grateful and thankful to have them on board as partners with Sports Spectrum. And their ministry is all about releasing children from poverty, giving children hope, giving children a future. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum. For $38 a month, you can release a child from poverty. You can give them education and tutoring and medical care and food and vocational training, all done in the name of the Lord Jesus for $38 a month. It's the best $38 you will spend every month. I promise you that. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum and sponsor a child today. Our guest today is Léonce Crump, former NFL player and current pastor of Renovation Church in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the author of Renovate, Changing Who You Are by Loving Where You Are. He also played his college football at the University of Oklahoma, where he also was a three-time All-American heavyweight wrestler. And Pastor Léonce is somebody I've wanted to have on this podcast for a while. I have a podcast interview bucket list of people that I really want to have on. And we've been able to accomplish a few of those recently with Kirk Cousins and Jenny Finch. And now I get to talk to Pastor Léonce Crump. And we're grateful that he came on the podcast to share his story, as well as to share some encouragement just about the church and the state of the church in general, some encouragement about where we are as a country, and really just enjoying his story of coming to faith, and then also the struggles, the real struggles that this man went through in his faith during his time in college. And I really liked his transparency in sharing some of the stories that he went through, some of the struggles that he went through during his younger days. And earlier, a few months ago, we had Andy Mineo, the rapper, and Trey Burton, the NFL tight end, formerly of the Eagles, now with the Chicago Bears, on the podcast. That was one of my favorite podcasts to do as well. And Andy Mineo, in that interview that I did with him, mentioned Léonce Crump. And he told a story that Léonce shared with him about the dangers of, the temptations that come, I guess, in being a influencer and being a famous person, especially a professional athlete. And so I asked Léonce about that, and he shares a very powerful story of his time in the NFL and the amount of temptation that exists, especially when it comes to women making themselves available to these professional football players. And it's a powerful story. And we talk about guardrails and boundaries that are needed in order to stay strong and firm in your faith when you are a public figure and when you're traveling. So without further ado, let's get right to it, because I really want you to hear this interview. I learned a lot from Pastor Léonce. It was as much about listening, really, with this interview as it was about me just asking questions. So let's get right to it. Here he is, pastor of Renovation Church in Atlanta, Georgia, former NFL player, Pastor Léonce Crump. Pastor, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Jason. Very glad to be here.
It's great to talk to you. We got a lot to talk about, both on the intersection of sports and, of course, of faith. You're a pastor now, but sports was always a huge part of your life, especially when you were younger. Let's go back to there first. Tell us about that love of sports growing up and what role that played in your life.
Yeah, I've been a lifelong athlete. I think the first sport I actually played officially was football, and really dreamt all my life that I would end up playing football. I started off as a running back, believe it or not, before I had about a 7.5-inch growth spurt, and I was a good running back. Yeah. And before his name became associated with all manner of other things, my father and my coaches said I ran like O.J. Simpson.
Oh yeah.
And so for the whole of my life, football, soccer, martial arts. My dad was a martial artist. Baseball. Sports played a critical factor in helping me shape discipline and working toward a goal and setting measurable steps with respect to that goal. And then just really gave me I believe, an early love of what it means to be a good steward of your body, which is certainly carried on into the later aspects of my life.
Was it always a dream of yours to kind of make it to the NFL? You go to the University of Oklahoma and play college ball there and make it to the NFL. Was that always a dream as a young person, or did you not even be able to dream that big?
No, actually, it was always a dream, and it really got rattled. I don't know how much digging you did, but I actually did not play high school football.
Okay.
It was a strange thing, but I was going to go to Catholic High, which produced some great football players, Major Applewhite and a few others, and I kept getting into trouble. But my placement scores were good enough to get me into a magnet school. And so my mother primarily insisted that I go to Baton Rouge Magnet High School. And they did not have a football team. In fact, they didn't have the big three at all. No baseball, no basketball, no football. And that is when I got into wrestling, which would eventually get me to Oklahoma University, which would get me back onto the football field.
That's interesting. Was it when you got on the football field that first time and you hadn't played in high school? Was that a wake up call for you, or was it literally like taking that first chance of riding a bike and you're falling off and you're falling to the side? Was it like that?
It was definitely more like riding a bike again, because as I joked and as I intimated, the last time I played was ninth grade,
Yeah.
Before Oklahoma University, and I was a running back. And when I got to Oklahoma, I was 6'4". I was about 230 pounds at that point. And other than Adrian Peterson, I don't know anybody running the ball at that size.
This is true. This is true.
Side note: when I first met him, I thought he was a new linebacker.
Yeah.
I was actually training for the summer, getting ready to start camp with the Falcons. And Tommy Harris introduced me to him, and I thought he was one of the new linebackers, and it turned out he was our freshman running back. I couldn't believe it. But yeah, when I started with Oklahoma, it definitely felt like riding a bike sideways, because first they were trying to figure out where to place me. I had decent hands and decent size, and so I started off playing tight end, but we were very, very deep at tight end at that time, and there was no chance that I was going to get on the field. And so then they moved me over to defensive end, and I had good instincts, but the schemes we were running at the time, the ends spent a lot of time dropping into coverage. I don't know if you watched Oklahoma football back in the late 90s, early 2000s, but Bob and Mike Stoops used to spend a lot of time dropping our ends into coverage, and I just was not picking up those short route schemes very well. And so they were really using me on a lot of rushing, because I could get off the ball quick. I think I was running a mid 4.5, low 4.6 back then. And so I get off the ball quick and get in the backfield quick. So I did a lot of stunts, a lot of rush plays. But in one game, Dvorak, Harris, and Magruder all got hurt at once. And I was the biggest end. I was up to about 260 at that point. And they moved me down to tackle, and I never moved back.
Let's talk about growing up, what life was like for you growing up with your parents and your house, and then faith and where that played a role in it when you were younger.
Yeah, so I grew up in South Louisiana, and like all people from South Louisiana, for the most part, my roots were part-time Catholic, and we went to Mass for special events. And we went into the church building for weddings and funerals. And that was about the depth of my experience of God as a young man. My father's faith was work hard, take care of your family. And my mother, sometimes she would do the rosary and things like that. I'd see her around the house doing it, but it really wasn't a significant presence. And then, which is so often the case, trauma created an opportunity for faith. And my mother, and she's told this story publicly, so I don't think I'd do her any disservice in sharing at least part of it. But my mother's a sexual abuse survivor, and she had really blocked it out in one of those classic psychological ways where she really had no recollection in her adult life of the abuse she had endured in her early life. And she started to have these really messed up dreams about this young girl being abused. And this happened over the course of several weeks. And toward the end of that time period, she's there as a bystander, kind of looking in, wanting to help this child. And the child turns, and it's her adult face on the child.
Wow.
And she realizes that this is her story. This is her narrative. These are not dreams. These are actually memories flooding back in. And so she had a really what would be considered a nervous breakdown in facing that reality. She went to her family, and her mother really told her to kind of get over it. I mean, that was the general sentiment. That's in the past. He's dead now, etc. And it really made her come undone. And she tried to commit suicide, and the gun wouldn't fire. She actually went outside with my dad's .38 snub nose with 6 bullets in the chamber, and she pulled the trigger 6 times. The gun wouldn't fire. And that was the beginning of real faith entering our home. So I think I was about 9 years old when that happened. So some of these details are, of course, have been shared with me from my mother since I've become an adult.
Yeah.
But I remember her saying that it was in that moment of brokenness that she realized that she needed God. And she would come to faith very soon after that. It was about 5 years later that my father came to faith, and then I did as well about a month before my 16th birthday.
Wow, that's a powerful story. I wonder, were you able to process all that at 9, 10 years old? Because I remember being 9 or 10. I grew up in a broken home as well, and some of that, like you say, is sort of sketchy and you're foggy, I guess, a little bit, and you have to kind of get the details from your parents or from those who lived through it, who are older.
Yeah.
But what was that like growing up? Do you remember, what are the memories, I guess, you have just being a 9-year-old, 10-year-old boy and hearing about this? Were you able to process that at all?
Yeah. The memories that I have that are very, very clear come in pieces. I remember coming home from school that day and my mother refusing to leave her bedroom. And that went on for a few days. And then her and my father agreeing to get her some inpatient care and some inpatient counseling. And I remember dropping her off for that, and her changing her mind and in tears begging my father not to leave her there. And it was one of 5 times in my entire life I saw my father cry. And I remember that very, very vividly. And my little brother crying, just asking for mommy. Those are a few of the snapshots that I have. I remember when we picked her up and when she came home, and how strange things were in the house because she was away for about 3 weeks. And I remember just a strange tension between her and my father, because he knew he had done what was right and she knew he had done what was right. But they had not really reconciled with the cost of that and the impact on their relationship, and I remember feeling that and kind of trying to, as the eldest child, trying to be the peacemaker, trying to make sure everybody was happy, trying to monitor the emotions of the house. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I'm the oldest of 3 boys, so I know exactly
Okay.
what you're saying.
Okay. So I do remember those things, and I, for all the people listening, particularly for those in ministry, but particularly for men, there's no shame in counseling. And I feel like there's a stigma with counseling for men, but particularly for men of color and for people of color. There's this strange stigma. But I've been very helped in my adult life by having a place just to process all of those things, because I didn't get it as a child. It's just like, hey, this is just what it is, and you just got to kind of live with it. And so it's been, in my 30s that I've been able to step back and say, man, that was a lot for a 9-year-old to bear. It was a lot to experience. And I know God has brought some beautiful things out of it, but there have been some impressions left behind that I'm still kind of working through.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book called Live to Forgive, and it's about the broken relationship with my dad. And in it is a chapter called Boxes in the Attic. And it's literally about these memories that you have when you're 9, 10, 11 years old that you don't even realize kind of are still there
Oh
until
yeah.
you pull the box out of the attic and have to confront it. And I wonder for you if that was what that kind of was like as you got into your 20s and 30s and realizing, yeah, everything looks great, but there's still some boxes in your attic.
Oh, absolutely. Because, for me, it's not even a broken home in a typical sense because my parents are still married.
Right.
They've been married almost 50 years. But there was, 4 or 5 year period there where we were all just kind of cohabitating
Yeah.
and trying to figure out how to relate to each other. And so, yeah, there are several boxes in the attic, so to speak, that I've had to confront, really, in how I relate to women.
Mm.
And have related to women in the past versus how I relate to my wife of 12 years now. How me and my younger brother relate and how hard it is for us to have conversations of substance because where I became the monitor of all of the house's emotions,
Mm.
he just kind of fell into himself
Mm-hmm.
and created his own internal world, which served him well for his role. He just retired from the U.S. Navy as an intelligence officer, and worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So somebody who can keep secrets, live in their own world, create their own reality, kind of not really mind the depths of their own emotions with anybody else is perfectly suited for an intel job.
Yeah.
But it's hard to be a brother. And
Absolutely.
so even just working through those pieces with him have been an interesting part of the journey.
We're talking to Léonce Crump here, the pastor from Renovation Church in Atlanta, former NFL defensive end. And I want to talk to you, Léonce, about your NFL journey a little bit. Take us through the experience playing pro football, coming from Oklahoma, coming into a place of prosperity, coming into a place of fame. Take us through that journey of becoming an NFL player.
Yeah, so my journey with the NFL is one of those rags to riches type stories. As I said earlier, I didn't play high school football, and I didn't get to finish playing college football. I was a 3-time All-American heavyweight wrestler, and coming into my senior year, the wrestling coach and the football coach uh, got into a bit of oh gosh, I don't know what to call it, but basically, they were treating me like a child from divorce, and I was going to have to live with one of the parents.
I got you.
And I had worked it out with the NFL, and you know about all the clearinghouse stuff, and the '80s where you got 4 blue chippers on 5 different scholarships, and you stack the odds for your team that way. And so the NCAA really put in some strict rules about being on one sports scholarship while playing another. But I appealed my case because I was already an All-American wrestler, so I wasn't using wrestling to play football. Make sense?
Right. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but my wrestling coach worked to have that appeal overturned so that I would have to choose between the two.
Hmm.
And I ended up choosing wrestling. And I think I made the right decision. That's one of those moments I go back and, over in my head and think, did I make the right decision? I have no doubts that I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, where I'm supposed to be doing it right now. But I wonder if some of the parts of the journey would have been different had I chosen to play football my senior year rather than wrestle. But it is what it is. I wrestled. I All-American again in wrestling that year. I competed and almost made the world team. And then I thought I was done playing football. And I actually enrolled in law school. And Tommy Harris convinced me to give it a go.
Hmm.
And so I began training the summer of 2004, and getting my weight up. That was one of the significant challenges. Is I would wrestle at 245, and I would play tackle at 285.
It's
And
a lot of
so,
weight, 40 pounds
yeah,
there.
yeah. So I had to try and gain about half of that over the summer before my free agent tryouts started. And I had 5 tryouts. I got picked up by the Falcons in the summer of 2004 and spent preseason with them. And then they traded me to the Saints. And I was with the Saints for just about 2 years, did NFL Europe when that was still the thing, played for the Amsterdam Admirals, and then came back and I got injured, and the Saints cut me in the midst of that injury. And I don't think it was because of the injury. Sean Payton came in and really just cleared house. You know, they fired the entire front office. I think they let go of about half the team, maybe more. And I was just kind of swept up in that process. And so I did the journeyman thing for a little while, went back to Tampa, went to the Redskins, went to St. Louis because the head coach for the Saints became the D coordinator there. And then after doing all that bouncing around, decided that I was going to go ahead and call it quits. Part of that catalyst, of course, was meeting Breanna, who's now my wife, and really trying to decide if it was going to be something real, and if that could happen with me playing for a different team every 4 or 5 months.
Mm. Yeah,
So
that football life is not a friendly one in a lot of ways because you don't know where you're going to be. It's the not for long acronym is literally a truthful thing because, yeah, you had a good career. You played a few years. You played more than anybody, you know, who never was able to make it. So many try to make it to the NFL.
yeah,
But that's a tough life to live,
it
especially
is a
from
very
having a
tough life to
relationship,
live.
right?
Yeah, very tough life to live, especially in the midst of a budding relationship and trying to recover from injury and all of those things and knowing, you know, to talk about fame. Yeah, I had some fame. You know, I was pretty well known. Sports Illustrated did a nice write-up, so did ESPN, the magazine, particularly because of my precarious journey to the NFL, having not played in high school, having only played a season and a half in college. You know, there was some real intrigue with just the sheer athleticism it took to get to that level. But I knew that I probably didn't have a 10 or 15-year career in front of me. You know, if I made my sports agent at the time, Phil Williams, he still insists that if I just made a few more sacrifices, that I would have had a longer career. But I wonder what would have been sacrificed on the other side of that decision.
Right. It's sacrifices that may be wonderful for your professional career, but not personally, right?
Yeah, and certainly a challenge to my faith.
We'll have more of our conversation with Pastor Léonce Crump in just a moment, but want to take a second to tell you about Compassion International, our great sponsors here on the podcast. We're so thankful for them and thankful that they are choosing to work with us and to be a part of what we're doing here at Sports Spectrum, and we're grateful to be a part of what they're doing. And what they're doing is releasing children from poverty and giving children a hope, giving children a future, and that's what it's all about. Compassion.com/sports spectrum, $38 a month. You can make a difference in a child's life. Go to compassion.com and sponsor a child. Compassion.com/sports spectrum. Release a child from poverty for just $38 a month. You can make a difference in a child's life. It will change them forever. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum and sponsor a child today. Now back to our interview with Pastor Léonce Crump, former NFL player and 3-time All-American heavyweight wrestler, right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. We had the rapper Andy Mineo on, very famous Christian rapper on our podcast a few months ago. Really good interview with him, and he was with Trey Burton from the Philadelphia Eagles, Super Bowl, now with the Chicago Bears, of course. And they were on the podcast, and Andy and Trey started a conversation, and Andy brought up your name, and he talked about just hearing stories from you about women in the NFL, the dangers of temptation. Oh, yeah. And I know you laugh, but it got really deep and serious about temptations, guardrails, trying to live out your faith. You said you were a Christian, became a Christian when you were a teenager. Take us through that and the sort of real life experiences that many people maybe don't see about being an NFL player and the dangers that come with that sort of fame when it comes to these temptations.
Yeah, so I shared with Andy and Lecrae, who is actually a part of our church community in Atlanta.
Yep.
I shared with them one story in particular where we were in off-season workouts, open workouts, and just the number of women that would just be on the sidelines,
Hmm.
watching the workouts and taking note of the players. And there were a couple who apparently took note of me. They knew my number. They were calling out my number. Um, and we had a I guess fairly normal interaction. But when I returned to the hotel during camp, then those women were there.
Wow. Yeah.
And I was cordial and I was kind and I was, trying to be respectful and dismissive at the same time. And
Yeah.
so after interacting with them and several others in the lobby, I mean, there were several women there and several players entertaining the idea of what would happen next. I just went up to my room. And several hours later, so it was very apparent to me that everybody had kind of gone out, partied, had a good time.
Hmm.
And several hours later, I hear laughter in the hallway and, herd of people coming down the hallway and deep voices accompanied by high giggles. And I hear two women calling out my name and my number
Hmm.
and looking for me. And I sat in my room, and it was really a watershed moment. And I thought, I've got the respect of my teammates and my coaches. As a matter of fact, if you dig well enough, you'll even find an article that was written about me, kind of being the team pastor, and several of my teammates called me preach.
Mm-hmm.
And I was team counselor, team pastor. You'd be amazed how many of these guys are pastors' kids living in constant conflict between what they know to be right and the choices they're making. And so, I'm sitting here weighing all of these things in the balance, like, good gracious, I am drawn to this moment. I by no means was a man who had not experienced, sexual intimacy before marriage,
Right.
and really found myself in cycles and seasons of sin at Oklahoma University with respect to that. And so I remember sitting there almost in a cold sweat, basically talking to myself and talking to God, saying, "You got to get me out of this, because if I make this decision, it is going to undo every opportunity you've given me to cultivate a respect for you and a respect for me, but most importantly, an opportunity for the gospel."
Yeah.
And that verse in Hebrews came to mind, that we can go boldly before the throne of God because we have a great high priest who's been tempted in every way that we have been tempted.
Hmm.
And I prayed that verse over myself. And after a while, the wave of temptation passed, even though the giggles did not. And so I just kind of hid out in my room until the hallway was cleared. And I
Wow.
guess they found somebody else to hang out with that night.
That's a powerful story. That's a powerful story. I wonder, you don't have to tell any more stories, but was that frequent? Was that consistent in your 4 or 5
Yes.
years? Wow. Really?
That was Jason. Frankly, that was consistent from Oklahoma University
Really?
into the NFL. There's a fame culture in the U.S. unlike any other place, probably in the world, and people want to be next to that energy or what they suppose is some sense of significance. And so, I remember my first wake up call was at Oklahoma University, and I did not face it so well as I did several years later. And really the last probably 2 years, 18 months to 2 years in college, was a constant battle that I feel like prepared me for not only the eventuality of what took place in the NFL, but to be able to stand against it well.
What did you learn from those moments that you take with you now? I want to talk a little bit about becoming a pastor, but what type of guardrails or boundaries now have you set up when you travel or speak or go about your business without your family, that
Yeah.
you've implemented based upon that time playing in the NFL?
Yeah, honestly, for the most part, I rarely travel alone. Um, just as a precaution for myself, I usually take one of my associates with me,
Yeah.
and if I do travel alone, it is usually a financial constraint on the place that's bringing me, and me wanting to help them be a good steward of their resources. And so, in the event that I do have to travel alone, I communicate consistently with of course, with my wife and with my team. And then I've just got a few parameters set for myself. I'm never alone with a woman, and that's in town
Yeah.
or home. I don't do one-on-one counseling sessions, even though it may sound strange or extreme. But I just avoid all unnecessary interactions um, uh, with women in any way that could even be presumed as misrepresenting who I am, or my faith, or my love for my wife and for my children. And so yeah, I'm very, very specific. Even in my speaker request form, it says, listen, Pastor Léonce generally brings an associate or his wife with him for the protection of his ministry. And if you can't afford to do that, then we will try to work with you. And so there have been times where, for smaller churches especially, I will cover out of my miles, out of my sky miles.
Yeah.
I will cover the flight for one of my associate pastors if they're able to pick up the hotel or something like that. When I feel like I want to be able to serve them, I know that I'll be good to serve them, but they simply don't have the financial resources to fly two people, across country, for instance. To Santa Barbara was one of those situations.
Tell us about becoming a pastor and the time that you spent in the NFL. They were calling you. You said you were kind of the team pastor. They were calling you preach. So tell us about when you had that sort of stirring or that moment from the Lord to go and plant a church and become a pastor. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So actually pastoring for me preceded planting the church that I pastor now. I knew I was called when I was 16, and we don't have time to go into the many crazy details about that. But Oklahoma from 17, because I started college when I was 17 years old, and which I don't recommend for parents out there.
Yeah.
But from 17 to about 20, I was on a roller coaster, a Van Wilder house party 1, 2, and 3 roller coaster. And my full-time job was partying, chasing girls, and doing sports, and school when I had time in between all of my extracurricular activities. And even though I knew I was a convert, I was not a disciple. Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. Yep.
No one had told me how to live out my faith, just to believe, and I believed. But I had no tools, and conviction quickly turned to condemnation, and condemnation sent me into a spiral. And I finally came to the end of myself one night when I just drank myself into oblivion. And I woke up the next day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in someone's front yard. I don't even know how I got there. And the last thing I remembered from the night before was praying to God, please don't let me die like this. I know the truth. I know you. Please don't let me die like this. And I woke up the next day, and I ran home, and I threw myself fully clothed into my bed, and I just cried, and just shame and guilt and pain and all these things culminating at once. And after a couple of hours, I remembered that there was a small church plant between two bars on Campus Corner called Victory Christian Center. And I'd gone in there on accident one night because we were doing a bit of a bar crawl, and I heard live music coming out of this venue. And so I'm like, oh, sweet, there's a new bar here. And I walked in, and I was like, oh, crap, that's Chris Tomlin. And I walked right back out again.
Chris Tomlin. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, not him live. They were playing a Chris Tomlin
Right,
song.
of course.
And I was like, good gracious, this is a church. And so I walked right back out again. But I remembered that church was there. And so I got up the courage to drag myself to church, which, side note for pastors, man, sometimes just getting there is an event for people. And we need to create grace and create space for that reality, that the first act of faith for them was just dragging themselves to a building to sit down and hear about Jesus. And so I did that. And I stood in the back of the room and just cried, just overwhelmed by the moment. And the pastor there, Mike Wilson, who's still a good friend of mine, he came up to me and he just grabbed me. And he said, "When are you going to stop running from God, son?" And I had never met this man in my life.
Wow.
Right. So, I don't know if we got any charismatics out there listening, but sometimes you got to believe in that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Because I had never met this guy in my life, and he just grabbed me literally by the collar and said, "When are you going to stop running from God, son?" And I broke into, loud crying. I sound like a Wookiee who had just gotten shot. And I'm like, no, and I'm just draped over him like a bad coat. And he's holding me. I mean, literally holding me up. Wow. And from that day forward, he began to disciple me. And he's the one that called me into ministry. So that same college ministry that I avoided when I was drunk, that I went to when I was guilty, I ended up pastoring for the last 2 years that I was in college. And
That's an amazing story. That's great.
It was crazy, man. And that was the beginning of pastoral ministry for me. And so,
but church planning is a different deal.
Yeah,
Tell me
church
about
planning is a whole different animal.
Planning a church. I know about that. Our church here in Connecticut has a church plant, and that's not an easy road or an easy step to take. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think there's about an 89% failure rate, actually, for church planting. But my wife and I got this bug that we were going to plant a church. And there's a lot of details that go into that I won't go into. I was totally avoidant to the idea. You do need to know that. And there would be no Renovation Church without Breanna Crump. She is the hero of the story. And so, we moved to Atlanta. We had no relationships here. I had a handful of folks from when I played ball, but none of them were Christians. So it wasn't like they were going to help me plant a church, or at least I didn't think they would. But one of them actually ended up doing so. That's another cool story. But we just moved to Atlanta with no support, no sending church, no money, no team, nothing. And we just started trying to be good neighbors. We worked jobs. I worked in foster care. She taught music. And we just lived as residents and citizens of Atlanta in downtown Atlanta for 3 years, hosting parties and hosting Bible studies. And all of those things culminated into our first worship service in January of 2011. We had about 180 people come out for that service. And with the oratory skill of what can only be called the young Charles Spurgeon, I preached that down to 70 within 2 weeks. And and that was our foundation, So February 2011, we had about 70 people that were part of Renovation Church. And God has been incredibly gracious to us since then. And we've just grown in leaps and bounds over the last 7 years.
That's tremendous. We're talking to Léonce Crump here. Renovation Church is the name of the church that he pastors there in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm just curious, being a former NFL player, now a pastor, I'd just like to get your thoughts on where we are in America as a church. You've been 7 years now in Atlanta, very culturally diverse, I guess you would say, in Atlanta, with many of the things that took place in the last year, with things like kneeling for the national anthem. It felt like that issue and many others, the country, obviously, you could look at, especially from a social media perspective, seemed very divided. But when you go into the church, and even my church up here in Connecticut, I felt like the church was extremely divided on a lot of these cultural issues. Yeah. And I kept shaking my head like, that can't be. Like, if any place is supposed to be united as followers of Christ, that should be the church. So what are your thoughts? Just give us your take, maybe an overview on where the church should be on these type of discussions and topics.
Yeah. So,
I don't know. There's a lot there, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of where to start. Let me start this way. The Western evangelical gospel is so myopic, truncated, and backfilled with cultural, political, and socioeconomic baggage that it is not surprising to me at all that the church was divided on these issues. What I mean by myopic and truncated is for the bulk of Western Christianity, really, but particularly here in America, the gospel has been preached as a personal salvation message with no social or societal or cultural implications. Therefore, I can be a Christian and be in the Ku Klux Klan. Therefore, I can be a Christian and be a white nationalist. Therefore, I can be a Christian and be an African American that literally hates white people, and not have to reconcile those realities, which are completely antithetical to the gospel and completely antithetical to the scriptures.
Yes.
And so, what I feel like I've seen over the last year is really a revelation of who the true church is, and who are those who have learned Christian, quote unquote, and evangelical practice, and perverted it with political ideology, and supremacist ideas, but who are not truly a part of God's church. And it's both a sad and exciting reality for me. Sad in that these people have a faith that is not going to get them to the heart of God, though they believe it might. And exciting because now that we see where the lines are drawn, we have an opportunity to actually preach the gospel into those spaces and really connect the dots for them, for many, in a way that they have not previously been connected. I hope that was a quick enough hot take.
No, of course. And I think that makes complete sense because it's a conversation is what I've discovered, at least from my perspective. I'm a 44-year-old white man, and I cannot understand or put myself in the shoes of an African-American person or a Latin person or somebody. I can't do that. And so I need to be quiet and stop telling people what I believe and start listening to have conversation. Do you find that's the biggest need in the church right now, is just having these conversations? What do you think is the biggest need here?
I think that's on like level 5. Honestly, I think level 1, as preachy as this sounds coming from the pastor, is a true understanding of what the Bible has to say on these things, right?
Yeah.
So we are so historically and biblically illiterate, and that's where the conversations come in. The conversation piece is, hey, Jason, where did 2,200 black legislators go in an 18-month period between Reconstruction and Jim Crow? How did all of those people get eliminated from their offices at once? That's the conversation piece.
Right.
But below that is asking the question, how can the church be commiserate in an institution like slavery? How can the church be commiserate in an institution like sharecropping? How can the church be commiserate in an institution like Jim Crow law and still say they believe the gospel? Because it goes so much deeper than some of the racial issues. I mean, I don't know your ethnic heritage. White is a social construct. That'll be a podcast for another time.
Right.
But before there was white, there was Irish, there was Dutch, there was Gaelic, there was Scottish, there was Welsh. And as a matter of fact, most people don't know that the Irish were the first slaves in this country. They were the very first ones. Before the Native Americans, before the Africans, the Irish were the first slaves here. And when institutions like the Electoral College were put in place, they weren't put in place to keep me from voting. They were put in place to keep poor white people from voting. And so you start to connect these dots and realize that, one, we do not have an accurate assessment of America and how she came to be. And two, we do not have an accurate understanding of the gospel. And between those gaps is where you find all of the craziness that has taken place over the last year, and find the church right in the center of it, and not really having a strong voice in the public square.
Pastor, you talked about the lack of knowledge that so many of us have on the scriptures, what's in the Bible, and becoming Bible literate, I guess, for lack of a better word. Is that something that you've been intentional about equipping your parishioners, the people who come to your church on a Sunday morning in your teachings to help equip them to become more literate when it comes to knowing what the Bible says?
Yeah, it's actually been an incredibly focused effort on my part, not just to resource Renovation Church, but really to resource as many churches as will avail themselves to helping to unpack that reality. So we've done entire series, preaching series on unpacking justice and equity from the Bible. We've done entire preaching series, kind of laying out Jesus' stance on human flourishing. And even now, as I'm in the midst of James, the context for the book of James, the letter that James wrote, the context is a group of messianic Christians in and around Syria in 44 AD who are being oppressed by the rich and the wealthy. Okay, so this is not just a spiritualized reality, but this is a real man writing into a real situation about one group of people being disadvantaged economically and socially because of who they are, and needing not only faith in God to navigate that situation, but also understand what God's role and plan and outworking in it might be. So being able to do that and unpack those things and point to texts like Colossians 3:11, now therefore there is no Greek or Jew, slave or free, or barbarian or Scythian, but Christ is all and in all, or Ephesians, that God has made one new man out of many, or Genesis 12 to Genesis 17, that the nations will be blessed through the line of Abraham, or Isaiah 42, that the nations will stream into Jerusalem. I can go on and on and on. It is one narrative being painted. Some of my favorites, of course, Amos, when he calls the wealthy oppressors fat cows of Bashan, who fatten themselves upon their meat and cover themselves with perfume, but have no care for the poor. Or Isaiah 58, when he says that God's people are restorers of streets, that they take on a fast that does not personally benefit themselves, but instead puts clothing on the back of the poor and food in the mouth of the hungry. Or James 1:27, in true religion being our care for the widow and the orphan. I mean, it's literally all over the Bible.
Yeah.
And if we can at least get the word into people's hands and hearts accurately, well, then now we get to decide. And this is one of the things, our church is incredibly diverse. We have about 30 different ethnicities represented. And so we're up against this all the time. And one of my elders is a 58-year-old white dude, right? And as we have been having these conversations over the last 7 years, that is probably the place where it is rubbed raw the most. And we've had to come back around to many of these ideas. And I remember in one of our most spirited conversations, he said, well, man, Pastor, I just feel like some of these people are just ignorant. And I'm like, and you know what? And I agree with that. But when ignorance meets knowledge, ignorance changes. And some of these people are meeting knowledge and they're not changing. They're making excuses, which means they're not ignorant. It means that they have made a willful decision to not believe the truth. And Bible literacy and historical literacy helps us to kind of separate that reality so we know who we're dealing with and where to invest our energy.
It's really good. Let's finish with this. Pastor, I think there's a false narrative that leaders in the church or even pastors aren't struggling with sin or even allowed to struggle with sin because of the position that they're in. But that's obviously not the case when you look at Scripture and when you look at what it says in Romans 3, where it says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So for you, Pastor Léonce, what's your biggest spiritual battle right now?
My biggest spiritual battle for my life will probably be hubris, pride. And I don't mean that in any cliche way. It is hard to be really good at what you do and not think that you're really good at what you do.
Coming from a football player, right?
Yeah. So I think that will continue to be a struggle. And then quite frankly, apathy is my second biggest struggle right now.
Mm.
There's so much going on in the nation that I'm just frankly tired of talking about. And I know God has called me to navigate this stuff and has called me to step into the middle of it. I know he has, but just to be honest with you, Jason, there are times where I just want to throw my hands up. I mean, the thought of having one more conversation about NFL players kneeling,
Right.
At the end of the day, I know why they were kneeling. You know why they were kneeling.
Absolutely.
We know how that narrative got hijacked and why it got hijacked and what it got turned into. And I'm just wore out, man, talking with people about things that they know better about already. And then I remember, man, how wore out God must be.
That's right.
Dealing with me and talking to me about things that I should know better already. So those are probably my two biggest battles right now.
He is Pastor Léonce Crump, former NFL player, pastor of Renovation Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Pastor, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. This is an interview I've wanted to do for quite some time, and I really appreciate your honesty and your heart for people, your heart for the Lord, and just wish you nothing but the best. Thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast.
Hey, thank you for the privilege, brother.
And we do thank Pastor Léonce Crump, Renovation Church in Atlanta, Georgia, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. If you are in the Atlanta area, I would recommend checking out Renovation Church. And I just appreciate Pastor Léonce coming on and sharing his heart, sharing his journey, really being transparent in a lot of the storytelling that he has shared with us on this podcast. And I would go back and grab a notebook and just listen again and take some notes from him, because I really thought what he said was powerful, and I really enjoyed him trying to bring together a church in unity through the body of Christ. And I love the way that his heart is really just situated in the right place to do that. And so thank you to Pastor Crump, a guy I've wanted to have on this podcast for a while, and appreciate him joining us here on the podcast. We appreciate you for listening to this podcast, and we appreciate Compassion International for sponsoring this podcast. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum. $38 a month makes a gigantic difference in releasing a child from poverty in Jesus' name. You can provide education and tutoring, vocational training, medical care, and the food that they need. Your $38 goes directly to help these children and releasing them from poverty. Go to compassion.com/sports spectrum and sponsor a child today. Thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast. You can email me directly, jason@sportsspectrum.com. We'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. We'd also love to have you leave a review for us on Apple iTunes podcast, as well as checking out sportsspectrum.com, which is where all of our content is found over at sportsspectrum.com. We have daily articles, we have daily devotionals, and we have tons of content on there, video and written articles, as well as every single podcast that we've done. Go check it out, sportsspectrum.com. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Have a great rest of your day.